All right, so thank you all so much for joining us today. Welcome to this month's Flatpage webinar, which is Building a Museum Guide. I'm Siobhan Carroll, Flatpage's executive assistant. I'll just share a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. So, as you all have just heard, this meeting is being recorded. So, if you're a guest, you can go ahead and keep your camera off and stay on mute. At the end, we'll have a question and answer session, which you're welcome to turn your camera on for if you like, or you can stay off camera as well, whatever you prefer. The recording of this meeting will go up on our website, so that's a great way to share the topic with friends or colleagues who you think might be interested, and it also means it's there so you can go back and re-listen. So no need to take overly vigilant notes. You can go back and check this information later. And it is also a great way to check out our past recordings. We do these webinars monthly, so be sure to follow us on social media and check back to learn about any of our upcoming topics. Today's presentation will be led by our co-founder and COO, Cara Jordan. During Cara's talk, you can go ahead and add any questions you might have into the chat, or you can message them to me directly, and then that way I can share them during our question and answer at the end. So now, without further ado, Cara, I can let you take us away.
Thanks so much, Siobhan. So I'm going to start my presentation. Here we go. So hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'm Cara Jordan, and as Siobhan mentioned, I'm the co-founder of Flatpage. We are a full stack editorial agency that works with museums, publishers, and cultural organizations on their editorial workflows, their publication development, and their content management. And today I want to talk a little bit about something that often gets overlooked in museum publishing, but that I'm asked about all the time, which is the style guide. It's not just a grammar document, but it's a system that really helps institutions to create more consistent, accessible, and manageable publications across their exhibitions, their catalogs, their labels, their digital platforms, really any sort of text that's coming out of your institution should be connected to that style guide. So it's a very important document. A lot of museums already have some sort of informal editorial practice, but maybe those standards live in scattered documents, in email threads, or in staff knowledge. So today we're going to be talking about how to codify that into one document. Museum publishing is uniquely complex because museums are rarely just producing one type of content for one audience. A single exhibition might involve wall labels, didactics, catalog essays, educational materials, website content, digital guides, press materials, social media. The list sort of goes on and on and on, as I'm sure you're aware. All of that content that's being developed simultaneously is happening through multiple different contributors. You might have curators, you might have other editors, designers, educators, external writers, communication staff, all of whom are contributing to the same publication ecosystem. And at the same time, exhibitions evolve throughout development. Interpretive frameworks shift, objects lists change, oftentimes last minute, deadlines are pushed. So without a shared editorial standard, inconsistencies tend to multiply extremely quickly. And that can lead to conflicting terminology, duplicated editorial work, slower approvals, and significant last minute production corrections. And sometimes that means it affects your budget. A style guideline helps create structure that inside that complexity. And those inconsistencies usually appear across many different visitor touch points. One challenge for museums is that visitors encounter institutional voice across many different formats and sometimes at the same time, simultaneously. A visitor might read a wall label in the gallery, a catalog essay at home, a mobile guide during the exhibition, and social media or marketing content online either before or sometimes even after they've gone to see the show. If tone, terminology, formatting, or interpretive language shifts dramatically across those platforms, the experience can start to feel fragmented. And we really want the experience to be unified across those different channels, even though they might have different tones. These inconsistencies are not always dramatic. Sometimes they're just cumulative. That means different date formats, inconsistent artist naming conventions, varying terminology, or shifts in reading level and tone. Over time, those inconsistencies can affect readability, institutional coherence, and even visitor trust. A style guide is what's going to help you unify those experiences across your print, across exhibition, digital, and communications content. So, what exactly does a museum guide do? I think many people initially imagine a style guide as a grammar document that lists all the different grammatical issues that you might encounter when you're editing a text. But in museum publishing, they function more broadly than that. A style guide creates shared editorial standards that help teams make decisions consistently across projects. And that includes maintaining institutional voice, reducing repetitive editorial debates, supporting accessibility, improving collaboration, and aligning print and digital publishing. And we'll talk about each one of these in a moment. Importantly, style guides also preserve continuity over time. Of course, we all know that museum teams change, hopefully not as quickly as we want them to, but definitely freelancers are rotating in and out, and exhibitions sometimes take years to produce. A documented editorial framework can help your institution maintain consistency even as those contributors and projects evolve over time. So, in many ways, a style guide becomes an editorial infrastructure that you're building on as you go along. And because of that, style guides are often cover much more than just grammar or punctuation. In practice, museum style guides often combine editorial standards, accessibility guidelines, and workflow documentation. On the editorial side, that includes voice and tone, terminology, formatting conventions, and citation standards. And all of these are things that you're going to have to decide, or someone at your institution is going to have to decide. Although we can talk a little bit more in the Q&A about what exactly that looks like in terms of your institution or your thoughts on it. For accessibility, we're looking at reading level expectations, inclusive language, alt text practices, and label readability. And operationally, in terms of the workflow, many guides also define the review stages, where it goes in the review process, contributor expectations, version control, and approval processes. So, how the text evolves over time. Especially for smaller museums, style guides become practical operational documents. They're not just editorial references, they actually guide your team through the development of the text and the editorial process. They help teams reduce uncertainty and create repeatable systems across projects. And this can be extremely helpful, especially if you have a lot of staff turnover. One of the most important places to begin, if we're going to start at the beginning, is with the audience. Audience should shape almost every editorial decision that a museum makes, and it probably already is at the heart of what you do at your own institution. Visitors arrive with very different levels of subject familiarity, educational background, language proficiency, and other types of expectations about your institution, your collection, the content, everything that you're showing. So, one of the key questions becomes for us as people who are involved in the editorial process, what knowledge can we reasonably assume about the people who are coming to your show and actually reading the text? And where does specialized language begin to create barriers rather than supporting interpretation? That doesn't mean that we're removing expertise or oversimplifying content. I never advise people to, dumb it down, so to speak. It means that we're really helping visitors to navigate interpretation more easily so that they can understand everything that you're trying, the story that you're trying to tell with your exhibitions. So, for example, defining specialized terms whenever that's possible, reducing unnecessary complexity, improving structure and readability, and thinking carefully about how visitors actually encounter the text inside the physical space if you have a physical space. I know there's digital museums that have it nowadays. Museum visitors are often reading very quickly. They're standing, they're distracted, or they're physically moving through your space. So clarity really matters. It matters enormously in terms of the text that you're producing. So, one thing that I'm always going to emphasize is that accessible writing does not mean that we're simplifying the writing. It means that we're writing with clarity. And audience considerations really connect closely to how we speak and our voice as an institution. And that's something that we'll include in our style guide. Every museum, of course, communicates differently. A sports museum is going to communicate differently about their content than a historical house or a botanical garden or a contemporary art museum. Some institutions lean more scholarly and research driven, while others are more conversational or even educational. Some prioritize interpretive storytelling or community centered language. So you have to think about how your institution positions itself. And this might be a conversation that's larger than just you, especially if you have a role that's within an editorial department or a publications department. There's also no one single correct institutional voice. What really matters in terms of your voice is that it's consistent. So visitors should experience a recognizable editorial approach that happens across all different types of text. So all those assets we talked about, labels, catalogs, websites, educational materials, digital guides, you name it, it should all be consistent. And without documented voice standards, the tone often shifts depending on the contributor or the department involved, meaning that if you have somebody in comms that's writing social media content, that might appear very different from the wall labels or the exhibition catalogs that you're producing. A style guide is going to help you to define how formal the institution sounds, how interpretive the writing should be, how much prior knowledge is assumed, and how audiences are addressed. And all of that's going to be very specific to your institution. So you're going to have to define that. That consistency strengthens both clarity and your institutional identity. Your style guide can include examples, and I definitely recommend examples wherever possible when you're creating your style guide for how your voice should be expressed in different formats. So you might create a grid that shows different types of sentences or captions that you might use for social media or interpretive guides or digital formats, and then provide example sentences so that everyone's on the same page. All right, so once your voice has been defined, the next step is standardizing recurrent editorial decisions, which is probably what you're more familiar with in terms of what a style guide is if you've seen one before. I'm sure we're aware, a surprising amount of editorial time is often spent repeatedly debating very, very small decisions, especially if you've been involved in the copy editing process, you're well aware. That's things like capitalization, date formatting, dimensions, hyphenation, titles, artist names, pronouns, measurement conventions, all of that sweet stuff. You probably already have an opinion about the serial comma and whether or not your institution's name should be shortened and how it should be shortened. Individually, these decisions might seem very minor, but across exhibition catalogs, wall labels, digital guides, all of those types of text that your museum is producing, those very small inconsistencies become extremely visible. And they also create production inefficiencies. That means that editors who are working on your text end up correcting the same issues repeatedly because the standards were never formally documented and they never had anything to explain it to them, whether or not they should use the serial comma, for example. This becomes even more of a challenge when you have different staff members or even freelancers who are working on different parts of the same project or even across multiple exhibitions over time. So one of the simplest ways to improve consistency is to document those recurring editorial decisions once instead of redeciding them every project. And a great way to start doing this is by looking through the past publications that your institution has put together and see if there's patterns over time. So look through the exhibition catalogs, especially the foreword, because that's where probably the director is giving some remarks, and you'll see what types of decisions have been made on the text in past iterations. So that's just to give you a sort of sense, and then you can start making decisions based on that. Surprisingly, tombstones are a very particular and very important example of how these grammar and consistency issues sort of take effect. It might be surprising to learn, but they're often one of the most technically complex and inconsistent parts of museum publishing. In fact, we have a whole blog post that's devoted to tombstones on our website. Information on your tombstone might originate from collection databases, your registrar, curators, previous exhibitions, or even external contributors. And each source might format that information differently. So without standards, museums often end up with inconsistencies in things like the artist name, how its accents and diacritics are used, artwork titles, dates, dimensions, whether or not we're using the X between the different numerals, medium descriptions, and how the artwork is credited. These inconsistencies affect both readability and production efficiency, as I already mentioned. So a very clear tombstone standard will create predictability across your publications and platforms so that everyone who's involved will know exactly how to format the information. It also reduces copy editing and proofreading time later in the workflow, which means that it'll happen a lot quicker and hopefully it'll be cheaper for your institution. It's always better for the bottom line. And tombstone information, tombstone standards, if you include them in your style guide, they also support accessibility too, because consistent formatting helps visitors process information more quickly, especially in gallery settings where people are reading under time constraints. If you have those time tickets at your institution, you want to get people moving along. We always have to think even in those portions of seconds rather than in minutes. So let's talk a little bit more about accessibility, because that's really where many of these editorial decisions are going to come together. Accessibility is sometimes treated as a separate initiative, but in practice, as many of us know, it's deeply connected to editorial standards. A lot of accessibility issues are actually writing and formatting issues, which means overly dense labels, undefined terminology, inconsistent captions, or text structures that are difficult to scan quickly in the gallery. And museum visitors are often reading in environments with distractions, like children, for example, people running around. Maybe there's an audio guide happening, people chatting. There's time constraints. There's varying levels of subject familiarity or language ability. So accessibility isn't just about compliance or the way that one navigates around a physical environment, but it's also about comprehension and how we can aid your visitors with comprehension. Clear structure, predictable formatting, and direct language help visitors engage more confidently with the content that you're putting out there. And one thing I'm always going to emphasize is that accessible writing, again, does not mean oversimplified writing. You can absolutely provide the nuance, the scholarship, the research, the institutional rigor behind your collection, behind your objects, while still making interpretation easier to navigate. I'm sure you're aware of this if you're working in any sort of educational capacity at your institution. So this also really closely connects to terminology consistency. And one of the most valuable parts of a museum style guide, especially if you're an editor on the project, is creating a shared terminology standard. Museums often reuse language across all the different types of assets related to exhibitions and collections. So that means collection materials, educational resources, website, interpretive content. And without documented standards like might exist in your style guide, terminology can shift from project to project or even within the same exhibition. This becomes especially important when we're thinking about artist biographies or culturally sensitive language, historical terminology, and even evolving institutional language. We really want all of those aspects to be consistent across time. Imagine that you wrote a wall label that had different diacritics on the artist's name than had in the social media posts. It's quite embarrassing for the institution when that happens, and I've definitely seen it. A shared vocabulary really helps maintain consistency, not just editorially, but also in terms of interpretation for your institution. It's going to reduce uncertainty for contributors and your freelancers because people no longer have to guess which phrasing or terminology the institution prefers. There's just one single source of truth that everyone can refer to. And importantly, these standards should evolve over time. And we'll talk a little bit about how to maintain our style guides, keep them up to date shortly. A style guide should be a living document that reflects changes in scholarship, accessibility practices, and institutional priorities. It's not something that's fixed. It changes over time, and we should all be open to that as part of our process in setting one up. All right, so up to this point, we've been talking about accessibility and consistency somewhat conceptually. So I wanted to show you a very simple example about how these editorial decisions appear in practice. These are two examples of museum wall label text. I want you to take a minute and just look at each of them and notice some of the differences between them. And if you feel inclined, you can drop it in the chat. What you see are some of the inconsistencies and perhaps how you might change the one on the left towards the one on the right. Pop it into the chat if you feel inclined. Yep, we've got less jargon in the new description. Some of the jargon is industrial materiality, which sounds very grad school to me. Sociocultural, post-war urban transformation definitely sounds like something I would read in a journal article rather than a wall label, for sure. Anything else you notice? The new label is much more concise. Yeah, we're getting to the point. We're helping people get towards the goal here. Yeah, we're looking at the date here. The date is inconsistent between these two. One is enclosed in parens and the other one separated by a comma. Not everyone knows whether primes equal the inches. I love that you wrote the primes because a lot of people think that they're just quotation marks. Yeah. Does anyone else notice the very, very small thing about the difference in the dimensions that I've included? The super, super tiny copy editing. Yeah, the wrong little X between on the right. It's one of the floating, it's a floating symbol X rather than the typed out X for sure. Yeah. So um, again, as you've all pointed out, on the left, the language is really professionally and institutionally appropriate, I would say, but it's slightly dense and it's less standardized, while on the right, the scholarship remains intact, but the formatting is a lot cleaner, the language is more direct, and the interpretation becomes easier to absorb in the gallery. So this is often what editorial consistency looks like in practice. It's not a huge dramatic rewrite of the text, but it's cumulative improvements in clarity, structure, and readability. And when all of your labels look like the one on the right, then your visitor is able to absorb that a lot easier over time. They're able to find the information that they want to. They know where to look in the label to get it, and they know that the interpretive text at the bottom is going to get the information to them as quickly as possible. And there are a lot of good resources out there in terms of actually how to write those interpretive labels. I'm not going to be talking about them today, but for example, the VNA, if you look up the VNA's guide to writing wall labels, they have a really great one. If you know of others, definitely put them in the chat because I'm sure your colleagues here on the call would be interested in what else is out there. One thing I want to emphasize in this webinar is that many museums, especially small and mid-sized ones, don't have formal publications departments. We're well aware of that. Editorial responsibilities are often shared across a lot of different contributors like your curators, your educators, designers, your comm staff, freelancers that you might engage, and other project-based contributors. People are wearing a lot of hats, even though I hate that phrase. And editorial decisions frequently live in email threads, track changes, or institutional memory. That's why we're here today. We're here to figure out exactly what needs to go into our style guide that we can share. One reason that style guides have such a large operational impact is because they start small and they grow over time, and they create one shared reference point for all of those contributors to use. So instead of redeciding, relitigating all of those questions about formatting, terminology, or tone with every single exhibition, teams can build repeatable systems that reduce pressure to speed up that collaboration. And this becomes especially useful when you're onboarding new staff members or freelancers or even temporary contributors, because those expectations are already made clear and are already documented. A related tool that's also extremely important that I would just want to mention is the project style sheet. I want to distinguish between a house style guide, which is the purpose of this webinar, and a project style sheet because they serve two different purposes, although they both have the word style in them. The house style guide contains long-term institutional standards. Even though I said that it's a document that evolves over time, it's going to have a lot of elements that may not evolve over time. It's how your institution expresses itself, and you want to keep that relatively consistent. So that's things like your voice, your formatting, your terminology, accessibility guidance, and editorial preferences, all those things that we talked about in the numbered slides just a few minutes ago. A style sheet is more project specific. A style sheet is going to be used by your copy editor and your proofreader for each exhibition or publication. A style sheet is going to track for that specific project or exhibition the names and spellings that are specific to it, the editorial decisions that were made along the way, formatting exceptions, exhibition-related terminology that doesn't need to go in the wider document because it's only going to be used once, and any evolving changes that happen during production. So it's really a place for the editorial, the design team to really communicate with one another about the decisions that they made. In practice, style sheets become essential essential working documents, really, that help during active editorial workflows. They help maintain consistency across your contributors, especially when projects involve large amounts of tombstone data, translated material, or multiple review rounds. And importantly, they reduce repetitive corrections later in the process. I just want to briefly touch on a case study because it really shows why editorial systems matter. Flatpage did the Venice Biennale catalog, sorry, where we had a lot of multiple contributors, translated material. There was a lot of evolving exhibition content. We had a very quick schedule for that project with a lot of text, a lot of tombstones, a lot of curatorial data. So in projects like this, and I know not all institutions are going to have a catalog of this size, but if you can just think about this as being like the big sort of example, consistency can't really rely on memory or any sort of informal processes or sending emails back and forth. You really need documented editorial standards. You need an active style sheet that can be shared across all of the contributors. And you need to have a clear workflow that maintains the coherence across the project. So For this project, we had two different editors that were working on different texts simultaneously. They were both using the same style sheet, which was an active Google Doc at the same time, so that they were seeing and making the same decisions or referencing each other's decisions. So in this way, we were able to maintain consistency. It wasn't just aesthetic, it really affected the production efficiency, our accuracy, our version control, and ultimately that trickles down into the visitor experience because your reader is going to notice when the text contains inconsistencies. I know we've all done it. We've been at those museums, we've looked and we've seen, especially if you have that copy editor's eye, you've seen those inconsistencies. And it really does affect how your institution is perceived, even if it's at that subconscious level. So the question here is really, where do you begin when you're making your style guide? That's why you're here. And one thing I always encourage museums that are creating their style guide is that it doesn't need to begin as a massive document. I've seen style guides that are 2 pages, and I've seen actually ones that are 150 pages. They can really be as short or as long as you want them, and they can definitely grow over time. In practice, your guide is going to work best when it's integrated into your workflow. And that's why I've included this little graphic here about how the publishing workflow actually happens. You're drafting it, you're having a review process, you design it, and then you publish it. A lot of editorial friction happens when these stages overlap or when they happen out of order. So even a lightweight workflow can create structure around how editorial decisions are made and documented. And I think about the style guide development also in a few stages. First, you're going to define, then you're going to standardize, and then you're going to operationalize. So, in terms of defining, you need to define your audience, your institutional voice, and your accessibility expectations. Those are things that you can brainstorm and you can bring back to your team, you can bring back to your executives and think about how you want to define those things in terms of your institution. And then you should standardize those recurrent decisions that you need to make. So, how are your tombstones formatted? What type of terminology are you using? What about formatting and naming conventions for your institution, your exhibition? And finally, you're going to put it into practice through operationalizing it. And that means providing contributor guidance, templates, review processes, and editorial workflows like the one that I've shown you above. So the most effective systems are actually really simple, they're really repeatable, and they're sustainable over time. Not every institution needs to document everything immediately. For smaller teams, it's often most effective to begin with the standards that create the most repetitive editorial friction. And that includes things like tombstones, formatting, artist names, credits, dates and measurements, and accessibility guidance. These are the sort of main pillars of what you should be thinking about first to create that sort of core of your style guide. And then once those systems are stable, you can expand into things like voice and tone, citation, if that's something that your institution has to deal with, terminology, and how you deal with digital versus print publication, and then things like onboarding. This helps the process feel more manageable rather than thinking you need to have a huge guide right off the bat. Your style guide should support your editorial work, not create more complexity for you and your team. So, alongside the guide itself, there are also tools and systems that are here to help you maintain that consistency. Style guides, of course, work best when they're integrated into your everyday workflow. And that might include things like shared style sheets. As I mentioned, my team often uses Google Docs for this, but you could use other shared systems. Editorial calendars, terminology lists, or databases if you have that, a CMS. If you're using CMS, you can have that there. QA checklists so that whoever is checking to make sure that everything is in line knows exactly what they're looking for, can tick it off, or version tracking systems. We love the Kanban system at Flatpage for tracking version and where we are in the workflow. The specific tools, so actually what platforms you're using, matter less than having shared processes. So we're really focusing on the shared processes here, and that's what your style guide is going to help you define. Importantly, tools support editorial clarity. They don't replace your judgment. I am a great advocate of human judgment. I still think that the human editorial layer is essential to our workflow, especially in museum publishing, where we're really focused on interpreting and creating context and making our objects and collections accessible to everyone. And that requires nuanced decisions that we're here to make as the people who are creating the style guides. And just because because your institution, of course, is evolving, your style guide is also going to need maintenance. This is another popular topic amongst museum editors. A useful style guide is never really finished, of course. Your institution is evolving. That means that your exhibitions are going to change, your terminology is going to change, accessibility standards are going to evolve over time, and your institutional priorities are going to shift. And that's why style guides should function as living and working documents. It's helpful to establish regular review practices. And what I mean by that is that you are documenting the recurring editorial decisions that you're making. You're adding new terminology, you're revising your accessibility guidance, and you're incorporating lessons from completed projects. Once your guide is created, you might also decide on a regular cadence for updating your guide. And I've heard from a lot of institutions that they do this either every 6 months or once a year, depending on the size and process that you choose to help maintain your guide. When making your updates, it's also important to gather input across departments and contributors. Often the people who are using the guide most actively are the ones who are identifying the gaps or the recurring points of confusion. So that's really where you should start, is figuring out who's using it, what have they found is maybe lacking there, what needs to be added or changed. And if you're a very small team, especially, practicality is going to matter here. The guide needs to be easy to access, easy to update, grounded in real editorial examples. So you might think about what platform you're using here and how easy it is to update it. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we also have one additional resource that we just published for teams that are contributing to this work. And who are trying to refine their publication editorial workflow systems. We recently published a free ebook called The Practical Guide to Museum Publications and Editorial Workflows. It focuses on exhibition publishing, editorial systems, accessibility, revision management, and these practical tools that I'm sort of, baseline covering here for museums who are managing publications across both digital and print platforms. So it's really designed for small and mid-sized teams that may not have a dedicated in-house editorial department, or you're learning about how to enact that in your institution. So today's webinar was useful. I hope it was. This is intended as a practical companion resource that you can use later, and it's available on our website. If you go to the museum page, you'll see it towards the bottom. You can fill out your info and grab your free PDF. All right, so with that, I'm going to open up to questions. So thanks again so much for joining. I really appreciate everyone taking the time to discuss what can really feel like an operational topic, not too sexy, but really one that I think has a major impact on how we communicate as museums. So I want to answer your questions, whether you post them in the chat or if you're welcome to put yourself on camera or just unmute yourself. We can talk about things like style guide development, your workflow, anything regarding accessibility. I'll try. I'm not an expert on accessibility, but I have some thoughts on it. Exhibition catalogs, or really anything related to museum publishing more broadly. I'm also happy to talk through tools if anyone has any questions about tools. Hi,
I
Mary.
ask a, oh, hi, can I ask a question just this
Of
way
course.
instead of, okay. Um, yeah, I've been on both sides of the editorial process, both as like an in-house, editor, project editor, and as a freelancer doing more like copy editing and that kind of thing. And it seems that one area where there tends to be a lot of editorial friction always is in between, the people who are in-house and the people who are external contractors. And I really appreciate your insights about, um, using the style guide to ease some of that sort of friction. But I do wonder if if you have any more sort of concrete examples of um, just making that sort of process of onboarding easier or that process of communicating between different parts of the process a little bit easier. Um, yeah.
So I think at least the way that we've, built guides for institutions before, we always include sort of like a how-to at the top for how people should engage with the house style guide, who's created it, why it exists at the institution, and how it can be used across the different stages in the editorial workflow. And I think that that is a really great way for, in-house publications teams to communicate. Of course, there's always, different parts of the onboarding process, like you might have calls, you might have, questions. A lot of that happens within the documents itself that you're editing. So when questions come up, I think that it's great to have a lot of things defined in the style guide, but also clear communication channels to be able to ask questions and especially thinking about contractors, because we do that part a lot, is figuring out how we can communicate best with not only the publications team, but also with the authors who are actually writing the text. Because as we know, especially just thinking about exhibition catalogs, we're oftentimes looking at, the director who's written the foreword, maybe the publications person has compiled a table of contents. Maybe there's a curator who's done an exhibition catalog essay or outside contributors. So it's thinking about how that workflow should be managed. I also recommend that there's always sort of one person at the institution who's communicating with the contractor team, rather than having multiple people on the institutional side. And that way there's a sort of clear communication channel with what the institution wants and how the contractor should deliver. And that can oftentimes just happen during the editorial or the onboarding process, rather than in the style guide itself. I think the style guide itself, should mainly pertain to how the institution wants to present itself, rather than managing those types of relationships. Hopefully that's touched on a lot there.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And I've seen different organizations manage it different ways. I think it's also often helpful to have like a contact list, right? Or a set of like, yeah, this is who you talk to about XYZ. But
Yeah, it's also great to have a platform where the people on the institution side and the contractors can communicate. For example, at Flatpage, we use a platform that's called Basecamp, which just underwent an update last night. But we use it for all of our projects, and it's a great way to exchange documents and have chats and memos. I find that with emails, it just like we get so many emails these days that that's a very difficult way for us to manage projects. But you might think about what works for you. I mentioned the Kanban project management system. And there's a platform that's called Trello, which you may be aware of, that's really great for publication processes. We've seen a lot of institutions use Trello, and it allows you to communicate directly with your contractors there as well. You can invite them on.
awesome, thank you.
Sure.
I see you do have a question here in the chat, Kara, if you want me to read it out to you.
Sure, I see it. Can the guide you create be incorporated into editing software so it can correct the manuscript? And what's the process to do that? And are there limitations on what can be included? Ooh, you're asking me about Perfected, aren't you, Edson? So personally, I use Perfected on a Mac, which does not have the capability of uploading custom style sheets into my Perfected. I think that you can create those and use them, but only if you have the PC version and you're using Perfected as an add-on to your computer. I know that it does allow you to connect with Chicago Manual of Style, which is a very common style guide for museums. So that's a direct link. But I personally don't have experience myself because I manage the company rather than doing the copy edits myself on actually uploading the style guide into Perfected. But if someone else does, please let us know if you've used that capability of Perfected. I'd love to hear. Any other questions? Things you've been working on? Troubles you've been having? Challenges that you've been facing? I'm here to help you troubleshoot. I do recommend, okay, so in terms of platforms for your style guide, I would create the document perhaps using Google Docs because it allows for a lot of different contributors to, live edit the same document live rather than using version control. And that way you can comment on things and you can set different permissions for it as you're going along. But I would create a static document when you're sending things out, sending it out to, let's say, your contributors for a catalog or your education team, so that people aren't editing it and changing it based on whatever decisions they're making. Instead, you should have a template for a style sheet, as I mentioned. That can also be a Google Doc and can be exported into Microsoft Word if the editor chooses to do that. So I would think about the different platforms that you use to create these different documents. Again, Google is good for some things, not for others. I wouldn't edit your catalog text using Google Docs. I would always still prefer Microsoft Word because it allows for these add-ons. But there are also other platforms that might host your style guide. And I know that our Bloomberg project coordinator, Jenny, uses Notion to house the Bloomberg Connects style guide. So I would definitely think about that, especially if you have a larger institution or you're expecting your style guide to have a lot of different parts, because it allows you to organize the information in a way that's really easily accessible by different people. So rather than having to scroll through like a 60-page document, it allows you to create different tabs, and that way people can find the information that they need really quickly. So I would recommend Notion for that. You can also use PDF, but it's a little bit more technical to create bookmarks and things on PDFs. Any other questions? Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining me. You have my email address. If anything comes up, definitely shoot me an email or follow us on Instagram or LinkedIn. You can follow me personally or Flatpage. We do have these webinars once a month, and they are occasionally about museum-related topics. And definitely go to our museums page and find that ebook that I mentioned. Thanks so much.